Night my father made his toast, I was sitting at the end of the table with a glass of sweet tea that had gone warm 2 hours ago. It was the 4th of July, and my parents had done the whole thing, red and white streamers across the back porch, sparklers in a mason jar by the steps, my uncle's famous potato salad that nobody actually liked but everyone pretended to. The kind of evening that looked perfect in photographs and felt like something else entirely when you were actually living it. My brother had just gotten promoted, regional sales director at 31. My father stood up, clanked his beer bottle with a fork, and the whole table went quiet. To Caleb, he said, who finally made this family proud. Finally. That word did something to the air. I watched my mother nod the way she always nodded, slow, eyes soft, like she was listening to a sermon. My aunt started clapping. My cousin whistled. And I sat there with my warm sweet tea and thought about the fact that 3 weeks earlier I had signed the papers to open my second clinic location. Nobody at that table knew. I had it told them because I had learned a long time ago that telling them things didn't go the way I hoped it would. I'm a physician assistant. I started my own urgent care practice at 29 in a town 40 minutes outside of Nashville, Tennessee. By the time my father gave that toast, I had 41 employees, a patient base of over 3,000 people, and a lease signed on a second location in a strip mall off Route 70 that I had negotiated myself. After 6 months of back and forth with a commercial real estate group that tried 3 separate times to lowball me because they thought I wouldn't know any better, I knew better. I had always known better. That was never the problem. The problem was that knowing better in my family was never the right kind of knowing. Let me tell you about growing up in the Mercer house, because you can't understand any of what happened without understanding where I started. My father is a man who believes that certain things are true because he has always believed them, and nothing that happens in the world is going to change that. He believed that men led and women supported. He believed that Caleb, 8 years older than me, was the one who carried the family name forward. He believed that my decision to go into medicine, not as a doctor, he always made sure to add that part, not as a doctor, was practical at best and a consolation prize at worst. My mother loved me. I want to be clear about that. She loved me in the way that some women love their daughters, quietly, apologetically, always with one eye on my father to make sure she wasn't loving me too loudly. When I graduated from my PA program, top of my class, my father said, "Well, at least you'll have job security." When I passed my boards on the first attempt, something Caleb's wife, who was also in healthcare, had failed twice, my father said nothing at all. When I told them I was opening my own practice, my father asked me who was backing me financially, and when I told him I had secured an SBA loan and 2 private investors on my own, he looked at me for a long moment and said, "Just make sure you have a backup plan." I was 28 years old. I had a business plan that my mentor, a woman named Dr. Patel, who had built 3 practices from scratch and sold 2 of them, had called the most thorough she had ever reviewed from a first-time owner. I had a backup plan. I also had a primary plan, a contingency plan, and a spreadsheet that I had updated every single week for 2 years before I signed anything. My father wanted me to have a backup plan. Caleb, meanwhile, had bounced through 4 sales jobs in 6 years, had my parents co-sign on his first car loan at 27, and once called me from a gas station in Bowling Green asking if I could Venmo him $40 because he'd left his wallet at home. I sent him $60 because I always sent a little extra, because that is what I did, because I was the one who kept the peace, who smoothed things over, who made sure everyone was okay even when no one was checking if I was. That's the part they don't put in the family photo albums. The first time I really understood what I was dealing with, I was 19. I had applied to a summer research program at Vanderbilt. Competitive. Paid. 12 spots for undergrads across the entire state. I found out I got in on a Tuesday morning and I called my mother from the parking lot of my university library because I was shaking and I needed to tell someone. She was happy. She was genuinely happy. I could hear it. And then I heard my father's voice in the background asking what was going on, and she told him, and there was a pause, and he got on the phone. "Vanderbilt?" he said. "That's in Nashville." "Yes," I said. "Your brother's trying to get a job in Nashville right now." I didn't say anything. "Maybe you could put in a word for him," my father said. "Since you'll be making connections, I was 19 years old. I had just gotten into a research program that accepted 8% of applicants, and my father's first thought was whether I could network on behalf of my brother. I said I would see what I could do. I hung up and sat in my car for 20 minutes. I did not put in a word for Caleb. He didn't get the job in Nashville. He got a different job in Memphis instead, which he left after 4 months. None of that was connected to anything I did or didn't do, but I spent the better part of 2 years wondering if I should have tried harder, if I had somehow let him down, if I was being selfish. That's what they do to you. They don't have to say anything cruel. They just ask the right questions at the wrong moments, and you spend years carrying the weight of their implications. When I opened Mercer Family Urgent Care, yes, I used the family name, I thought it mattered then. My parents came to the ribbon cutting. My father shook hands with my business partner, a PA named Jonathan, who had come on as my clinical director, and spent most of the event talking to Jonathan about the practice, about the equipment, about the lease terms, like Jonathan had built it. Jonathan had built it. Jonathan, to his credit, kept redirecting. "You should really be asking Sloane," he said more than once. "This is her vision entirely. My name is Sloane. Sloane Mercer." I have never once in my adult life introduced myself and not had someone say it was an unusual name, and I have never once not smiled and said thank you, because that is what you learn to do when you grow up being told that your instincts are wrong. My mother took a photo of me in front of the clinic sign that day. She texted it to me later that night with a row of heart emojis and nothing else. I still have that text. I look at it sometimes when I forget what quiet support actually looks like. The business grew faster than I had projected, which is not something I say to brag. It's relevant to what happened next. By year 2, I was in the black. By year 3, I had hired 2 additional PAs, a full billing department, and had negotiated an agreement with 3 local employers to provide occupational health services. My name started appearing in local business press. The Nashville Business Chronicle ran a short piece on me when I was 29 with the headline, "Youngest Solo Practice Owner in Williamson County." My father called me after that one. "They didn't mention Caleb's promotion in that article," he said. I genuinely did not know what to say to that. "He just made director," my father said. "You could have mentioned it to the reporter." I reminded my father, as gently as I could, that the article was about my clinic. He said, "I know that, Sloane. I just think it would have been a nice thing to do for your brother." I got off the phone and went back to reviewing payroll. Here is what I did not know was happening while I was reviewing payroll. Caleb had been talking to my parents about money. His own financial situation had gotten complicated. A combination of lifestyle creep, a failed side investment in a food truck that never actually launched, and a divorce that he had initiated and that had still somehow cost him more than he expected. He was behind on things. Not catastrophically, but enough that it was a problem. And apparently, at some point, my parents had suggested to him that he talk to me. Not to ask for my help directly. Not to sit down with me and say, "Hey, I'm struggling, is there anything you can do?" That would have required a kind of honesty that my family had never really practiced. What Caleb did instead was this. He called me on a Sunday afternoon when I was prepping for the week and started asking questions about the business, friendly questions, curious questions. How was the expansion going? Had I thought about investors? Was I still working with the same accountant? I thought he was just catching up. I told him about the second location. I told him I had been in conversations with a regional hospital group about a potential partnership that would have brought my clinic under a larger umbrella while letting me retain operational control. I told him the accountant had flagged some tax optimization strategies that I was reviewing with my attorney. I told him too much. I told him because he was my brother and because part of me, even then, still wanted us to be the kind of siblings who talked about real things. 2 weeks later, I got a call from a contact at the hospital group. She sounded careful on the phone, the way people sound when they're about to say something they don't want to say. She told me that someone had reached out to the group's CFO, had expressed concerns, had suggested that I was financially overextended, that the second location was a risk I hadn't fully calculated, and that the partnership might expose the hospital group to liability. She didn't say who. She didn't have to. I knew the specific language that had been used because I recognized it. It was the language of someone who had heard me describe my own business strategy and then reverse engineered it into doubt. I sat in my office for a long time after that call. I had a plant on the windowsill, a pathos I had kept alive since PA school, which I know is not hard to do, but which I had always felt irrationally proud of. I looked at that plant for a while. Then I opened my laptop and started making phone calls. The hospital partnership fell through. That part I cannot change. By the time I had begun to rebuild the relationship with the CFO, the timing had shifted, and the group had moved forward with a different arrangement. 6 months of work, gone. I did not confront Caleb immediately. This is something people find strange when I tell them. Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you call him out? Because I needed to be sure. And because I had spent my whole life being gaslit into thinking my perceptions were wrong, and I needed to stand in front of this with something solid before I opened my mouth. What I found over the next 8 weeks was solid. A mutual acquaintance confirmed that Caleb had made calls. A text thread, shared with me by someone who had been on the receiving end of one of those calls and felt guilty enough about staying silent to finally say something, showed my brother describing my business in terms designed to sound like concern while functionally being sabotage. She stretched thin. I'm worried about her. I just think the hospital group should know what they're getting into. The language of a caring sibling wrapped around a blade. I also found out that my father knew. Not in the way of having organized it, but he had known Caleb was making those calls and he had not stopped him and he had not told me. When my mother, who I don't think knew, later learned the truth and asked my father why he hadn't said anything, he told her it wasn't his business to interfere. His daughter's livelihood, not his business. The moment came, as these moments always do, at a family gathering. It was Thanksgiving. My mother had done the table the way she always did. Cloth napkins, the good china, a centerpiece that she rebuilt every year from dried leaves and small gourds she collected starting in September. She loved that centerpiece. I think it was the one thing in the house that was entirely hers. My father said grace, which he always kept short. Then he picked up his wine glass and said he wanted to say something. He talked about the year. He talked about being grateful. He talked about Caleb's new apartment, which was in a nicer part of the city than the old one. He talked about how proud he was to see his son building something real. He did not mention me, not once. I had driven 2.5 hours to be there. I had brought a pie from a bakery in Nashville that my mother had mentioned, once in passing, that she had always wanted to try. I had brought wine. I had blocked out the travel time in my clinic schedule 3 months in advance. My father finished his toast and sat down, and my uncle said, "Here, here," and everyone drank. I put my wine glass down and looked at my father. He was already reaching for the rolls. "I'd like to say something too," I said. He looked up. The table got quiet the way tables get quiet when someone uses that particular tone of voice. I did not cry. I want to tell you that clearly. I had decided, somewhere on the drive over, that I was not going to cry, and I didn't. I said, "This year I opened my second clinic location. I have 53 employees. My practice was named one of the top independent urgent care providers in Middle Tennessee." I paused, and I found out that Caleb Big calls to undermine a hospital partnership I'd been building for 6 months. "And that you knew, Dad, and that you didn't tell me." The room was completely still. Caleb started to say something. I looked at him, and he stopped. My father said, "This isn't the place for this, Sloane." "You made a toast," I said. "I'm making one too." I raised my glass. I looked at my mother, who had gone very still and was looking at the centerpiece. I looked at my aunt, who was looking at her lap. I looked at my father. "I built something real," I said. "I built it alone, and I would have liked your support, but I didn't need it, and I won't be coming back here looking for it anymore." I set my glass down. I picked up my purse. I said goodbye to my mother. I drove 2.5 hours home in the dark with the radio off. People asked me what happened next. What happened with Caleb? What happened with my father? Whether we made up, whether things changed, whether there was some moment of reconciliation that made it all make sense. Here's what happened next. I hired a new business development director, and we rebuilt the hospital outreach strategy from scratch. 14 months later, I signed a different partnership agreement. Better terms than the original, with a regional health system that I had not previously considered because I hadn't needed to look that far. The partnership brought occupational health contracts that doubled my B2B revenue in the first year. Caleb called me in February, 4 months after Thanksgiving. He said he wanted to explain. I told him I understood exactly what had happened and that I didn't need an explanation. He asked if we could have lunch. I said not right now. He said, okay, and hung up, and I haven't heard from him since. My father called me once. He said he thought I had been dramatic at Thanksgiving. I said I disagreed. He said he hoped I would think about whether it was worth throwing away my family over a business thing. I said I hadn't thrown anything away, that things had been set down a long time ago, and that I had just finally stopped picking them up. He didn't have a response to that. My mother and I talk on the phone every Sunday. She tells me about her garden. I tell her about the clinic. We don't talk about Caleb or my father, and she doesn't ask me to. It's the most honest our relationship has ever been, and I am grateful for it even in its smallness. Last March, I was in Washington, D.C. for a healthcare policy conference. I do that now. I show up to the rooms where people make decisions about independent practice regulations and scope of practice laws, because someone has to be in those rooms, and it might as well be someone who has actually built something and knows what those decisions cost in real terms. I was on a panel. There were 4 of us, a physician from Ohio, a practice management consultant from Boston, a health economist, and me. The moderator introduced me as the founder of a multi-site urgent care practice with a model that had been cited in 2 separate state-level policy briefs. Afterward, a woman came up to me. She was young, maybe 24, in the kind of blazer that tells you someone is still figuring out how to dress for the rooms they want to be in. She asked me how I had gotten started. She asked about funding, about scaling, about what had been the hardest part. I thought about the answer for a second. Believing that I was allowed to take up space, I said. That took longer than it should have. She wrote that down in her notebook. I don't know her name. I hope she's building something. Here's what I know now. That I did not know when I was 28 and opening my first clinic and trying to prove something to people who had already decided what I was worth. The approval I was looking for was never going to come from them. Not because they were incapable of giving it, though I believe that too, but because the person I needed to approve of me was me, and I had been outsourcing that job to people who had a conflict of interest. My father wanted a son who built things. He got a daughter who built things. He didn't know what to do with that, and he made his confusion my problem for 3 decades, and somewhere along the way I agreed to carry it. I put it down at a Thanksgiving table in November in front of the good china and the dried leaf centerpiece, and I have not picked it back up. I have 53 people who show up to work every day at something I built. I have patients who drive past 2 other urgent care clinics to come to mine because they know they'll be seen on time, treated well, and sent home with a plan that makes sense. I have a second location that has been profitable since month 8 when my projection said month 14. I have a Pazos plant that has been alive since 2017 and has survived 3 office moves and 1 very bad winter when I forgot to water it for almost a month. I have a mother who calls me on Sundays, and I have a life that is entirely uncomplicatedly mine, which is the thing they never wanted for me and the thing I am most grateful for now. Success is not the loudest thing. It doesn't announce itself at dinner tables or make toasts. It just keeps growing, quietly, in whatever direction the light is. I learned to find my own light. That's the whole story. I've thought a lot about why it took me so long to say what I said at that Thanksgiving table, not the words themselves. Those had been sitting in me for years, fully formed, just waiting. What took so long was the belief that saying them would cost me something I couldn't afford to lose. That's the thing about growing up in a family where love is conditional and quiet and always slightly out of reach. You start to confuse the people who are supposed to be in your corner with the corner itself. You think, if I lose them, I lose the foundation. What I didn't understand, what took me until my early 30s to really understand, is that I had built my own foundation years ago, one decision at a time, and that I had been standing on it the whole time without giving myself credit for it. Caleb didn't sabotage me because he was evil. I want to be honest about that. He did it because he was scared and because he had been handed a story about who got to succeed in our family, and I was disrupting that story simply by existing and building things. That doesn't excuse what he did. It doesn't make the 6 months of work I lost on that hospital partnership hurt any less, but understanding it keeps me from carrying the kind of bitterness that would have eventually made me smaller than the people who hurt me. And I refused to become smaller. That was the one thing I was always sure about. My father is a man who taught me entirely by accident that you cannot wait for permission to take your own life seriously. Every time he looked past me, every time he asked what Caleb needed in the same breath, I told him something I had accomplished. Every time he said, just make sure you have a backup plan, he was showing me, without knowing it, that the validation I was searching for was never going to live in his house. So I had to build a house of my own. Literally, eventually. A clinic. 2 of them. There's a version of the story where I stay angry, where I spend the next decade carrying what they did to me like luggage I drag from room to room. I know people who live that version, and I understand it because the anger is real and it is earned. But anger, held long enough, becomes the thing that defines you instead of the thing that happened to you. I did not want to be defined by my father's limitations or my brother's fear. What I wanted, what I chose, was to be defined by what I built after I stopped asking them to believe in me. The choices we make when we are hurt reveal more about our character than the choices we make when things are easy. I could have made smaller choices. I could have shrunk. Instead, I signed leases and hired people and showed up to rooms in Washington, D.C., and said what I thought about policy that affected practices like mine because that is what integrity in motion actually looks like. Not a grand gesture, just continuing to do the next right thing, even when you're tired, even when someone you loved just tried to cut the ground out from under you. I still have that pothos plant, still alive, still growing toward whatever light it can find. I think about that sometimes when I water it, how quietly things grow when you just stop getting in their way.